Grace Walker moved silently through the marble corridors of the Massachusetts Superior Courthouse, her janitor's cart squeaking softly with every step. At 24 years old, she had become invisible to most of the high-powered attorneys and sharply dressed interns who swept past her daily. Nobody cared about the cleaning lady, especially not one who smelled faintly of disinfectant and wore worn sneakers with soles half detached. But Grace didn't mind. Invisibility had become her shield. She had taken the job after dropping out of law school a year earlier, not because she wasn't smart enough, but because the full scholarship she'd earned had vanished after her mother's health crisis drained the family's resources. Now, every afternoon, Grace cleaned the very building where she had once dreamed of making impassioned arguments and changing lives with justice. Instead, she scrubbed bathrooms, emptied trash bins, and swept away the crumbs of privilege. On this particular Tuesday, something made her pause. Courtroom 3A was unusually packed. Lawyers murmured tensely near the judge's bench. Journalists huddled by the door, clutching notepads and whispering names Grace vaguely recognized from business headlines. A tall man in a pristine suit stood at the defense table alone. Grace glanced at the schedule posted outside the courtroom. State of Massachusetts versus Harrison Cole. Her breath caught in her throat. Harrison Cole, the billionaire tech CEO accused of securities fraud, insider trading, and corporate deception. It had been all over the news for months. Everyone assumed he would be found guilty. But why was he standing alone? She edged closer, pretending to wipe a fingerprint from the glass wall. A heavy-set bailiff muttered under his breath, "No lawyer would stay." All walked out this morning when the judge refused a postponement. Grace's eyebrows lifted. A lawyer walked out on a client in open court. "Mr. Cole," Judge Harper was saying from the bench, "you have no legal representation present. Do you intend to represent yourself?" The billionaire's voice was low but steady. "I don't have much choice, Your Honor. My entire legal team withdrew this morning after pressure from their parent firm. Apparently defending me has become inconvenient." The courtroom stirred. Murmurs swelled. Grace's stomach twisted. She knew that look. Not arrogance, not guilt, isolation. The kind of aloneness that weighed heavier than prison walls. The judge exhaled deeply. "Mr. Cole, these are serious federal charges. If you cannot secure counsel, I may have to assign public representation. However, I am obligated to continue proceedings as scheduled." A ripple of discomfort passed through the gallery. Grace's fingers tightened on her mop handle. Something about the man's stillness at the defense table, the way he stood like a soldier bracing against fire, unsettled her. It stirred something she thought she'd buried a long time ago. The judge continued. "The prosecution may proceed with opening statements tomorrow morning. Court is adjourned." As people began to leave, Grace lingered at the doorway. She watched as Harrison gathered his papers neatly, methodically, without rushing. He wore his isolation like armor. Then for a brief second their eyes met. She froze. He didn't look away. There was something raw in his expression. Not defeat, not entitlement. Something deeper. Something that made Grace's chest tighten. She wheeled her cart away before she could be noticed, but all through the afternoon, her thoughts kept returning to him. The billionaire who stood alone, abandoned in a courtroom that once echoed with his name. By the time her shift ended, Grace was no longer cleaning. She was remembering. Remembering how her mother used to call her the girl with the fire tongue. How her professors had begged her not to leave school. How she once memorized courtroom procedures the way others memorize song lyrics. And remembering that Harrison Cole hadn't looked at her, like she was invisible. That night in the tiny apartment she shared with her cousin Grace, sat at the kitchen table with an open legal pad and a pile of old textbooks she refused to sell. She reread the basics. She researched the case. She pulled every article, motion, filing, and press release she could find. She knew she wasn't licensed, knew how insane it sounded, but she also knew what it felt like to be abandoned. And she recognized something no one else seemed to. Something was off about this case. The numbers didn't add up. The timeline was too neat. The collapse of his defense team, too convenient. By midnight, Grace stared down at the outline she had drawn across 4 pages of notes. "I know what they're trying to do to you," she whispered aloud as if Harrison could hear her across the city. "And I won't let them." It was madness. But for the first time in a year, Grace Walker felt alive again. The next morning, Grace stood outside Courthouse Room 3A in a neatly pressed blouse and blazer she hadn't worn since her last moot court. Her hair was pulled back, and in her hand she held a manila folder filled with documents she'd spent all night preparing. As the crowd began to file into the courtroom, she took a steadying breath and followed them in. Not with her mop cart this time, but with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. Harrison Cole was already seated at the defense table alone once again. He looked tired, as if the weight of a corporate empire and a crumbling future were pressing on his shoulders. When Grace walked in, he glanced toward her surprised. She didn't sit. She walked directly up to the defense table, causing whispers to ripple through the room. Judge Harper entered a moment later, pounding the gavel. "Court is now in session." Before we begin opening statements, he paused, frowning as he noticed Grace standing by Harrison. "Young lady," the judge said sternly, "this is not a public speaking platform. If you are not legal counsel or party to this case, please take your seat." Grace swallowed hard. "Your Honor, my name is Grace Walker. I'm not an attorney. I was a law student at Suffolk until last year, and I believe Mir Cole is being railroaded." Gasps echoed in the gallery. The prosecutor, a sharp-jawed man named Simon Faulkner, smirked. Judge Harper narrowed his eyes. "Miss Walker, unless you are a licensed member of the bar, you are not permitted to speak before this court." "I understand, sir," she said, holding up the manila folder. "But I've spent the last 12 hours going through this case, and something is seriously wrong. I believe I can offer information that would at least grant Mr. Cole a stay until he receives proper representation." Judge Harper hesitated. So did everyone in the courtroom. Cole turned to look at her, then really look. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "Because someone should," Grace answered. Faulkner stood incredulous. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We cannot allow janitors with no legal credentials to derail a federal case." "She's right," came a voice from the back. All heads turned. It was an older woman, one of the senior clerks from the records office. "I saw her in here every night for the last year, studying long after her shifts ended. She's not some prankster. That girl lived and breathed the law before life kicked her sideways." The judge let out a long sigh. "Miss Walker, what exactly are you proposing? Let me speak just for 5 minutes. If nothing I say matters, I'll leave quietly. But I think you'll find that the evidence against Mr. Cole doesn't hold up under scrutiny." Judge Harper studied her. Then, to everyone's shock, he nodded. 5 minutes. Grace stepped forward, placed her folder on the table, and began. She walked the courtroom through a trail of financial documents, public records, and timing discrepancies. She questioned how the prosecution's star witness had suddenly reversed statements 2 weeks before trial. She highlighted how the same law firm that dropped Cole also represented his largest competitor. She didn't scream. She didn't grandstand. She simply laid it all out like puzzle pieces falling into place. By the time her 5 minutes were up, the room was silent. Judge Harper finally cleared his throat. "Miss Walker, while I cannot recognize you as official counsel, I must admit your findings raised legitimate questions. Mr. Cole, do you wish to retain this?" Advisor Harrison turned toward Grace again. "Yes," he said simply. "If she's willing." Grace nodded. "I am." Faulkner was already objecting. "Your Honor, this is enough." "Mr. Faulkner," the judge snapped. "Miss Walker, I will grant a continuance of 72 hours. In that time, if Mr. Cole wishes to formally appoint legal counsel, he may do so. Until then, this court is adjourned." The gavel hit the block. Murmurs filled the room. As everyone filed out, Harrison leaned in. "Why did you really come up there today?" Grace hesitated. "Because no one else would. And I don't think you're the villain they've made you out to be." He nodded slowly. You just risked your reputation and your job to help me. Why? She looked him in the eye. Because I know what it feels like to be judged for something you didn't do. I wasn't supposed to be a janitor. And I don't think you're supposed to be a criminal. He gave the smallest smile she'd seen from him. Then let's prove them wrong. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed shouting questions. But Grace didn't stop. She had 3 days to build the defense of a lifetime. And this time she wasn't going to clean up someone else's mess. She was going to make history. The courthouse lobby was buzzing with confusion. Grace could feel the stares follow her as she and Harrison exited through a side door. Reporters barked questions, their flashes popping like fireworks behind the glass. But Grace kept walking her steps steady, even though her mind reeled. Outside, the afternoon air was crisp. Harrison adjusted his tie as if trying to reassert control, but Grace could see the tremor in his fingers. I meant what I said in there, she told him quietly. But you need to be honest with me now. No filters. No billionaire charm. He paused, then looked at her. All right, I will. They ducked into a nearby cafe, nearly empty except for a few students typing on laptops. Grace ordered 2 coffees and sat across from Harrison in a booth that felt far too casual for what had just happened. The moment hung in the air between them. Start from the beginning, she said. What exactly are they accusing you of? He leaned back and exhaled slowly. Embezzlement. Corporate fraud. The SEC claims I siphoned over $50 million through a network of fake vendors and offshore accounts. Grace blinked. Did you know? He said it firmly, but there was something in his eyes that made her hesitate. But he continued, I know who did. I just never expected them to betray me. Grace leaned forward. Who? He hesitated, then pulled a small flash drive from his pocket. Everything's on here, but if I use this, it burns bridges I spent a decade building. People close to me. People I trusted. Grace didn't reach for it. Then why haven't you turned it in already? Because I thought I could fix it quietly. Keep the company intact. Protect the employees who depend on me. And maybe because I was afraid no one would believe me anyway. Grace nodded slowly. She understood that kind of fear, the kind that stops you from defending yourself because the system is stacked against you. Because once people see you as guilty, proving, otherwise feels like yelling in a windstorm. Let me look at it, she said. Back in her studio apartment that evening, Grace sat cross-legged on her floor laptop, open coffee long cold. Harrison's flash drive revealed a twisted network of shell companies' fake invoices and data trail manipulations. It wasn't sloppy. It was genius, almost too clean. But the deeper she dug, the more patterns began to emerge. A name popped up repeatedly in internal email approvals, Jacqueline Vance Coltech's CFO. Grace remembered the name from press articles. Jacqueline had been praised for modernizing the company's financial strategy during the same quarter the fraud allegedly occurred. Grace frowned. In the files, she noticed timestamps that didn't add up. Emails, supposedly sent by Harrison, were identical to others sent by Jacqueline an hour earlier, except for one thing: a change in metadata. She checked the document properties, then cross-referenced the logins. Her breath caught. The access came from an account named hcole-alt-admin, but the terminal it logged in from was Jacqueline's. That's when the twist clicked into place. Someone had spoofed Harrison's internal credentials, likely with IT's help, and routed all activity through Jacqueline's department. Then they deleted records and redirected blame just days before an internal audit. She stared at the screen, a lump forming in her throat. Not only had Harrison been set up, he'd been abandoned the moment it stopped serving their agenda. And she knew something else now. Whoever was behind this had connections deep enough to convince even Harrison's own lawyers to step away. The following morning, Grace returned to Coltech. Security was stricter this time, likely due to the media frenzy. But Harrison had arranged clearance. She was escorted to a quiet upper-floor conference room. Harrison was already there, suit pressed tie tighter than before. "What did you find?" he asked without preamble. She opened her folder and laid it out. The falsified terminal access, the identical invoice codes, the metadata discrepancies. When she finished, Harrison sat back stunned. "Jacqueline," he murmured. "She was with me from the beginning. We built this company side by side. And now she's using your name to destroy it," Grace said gently. He looked at her, something shifting behind his eyes. Pain, disillusionment, maybe even guilt for not seeing it sooner. "What now?" he asked. "We go to war," Grace replied. He raised an eyebrow. "I mean court," she added, cracking a tired smile. He smiled too, but there was something else in it. Respect. As she packed up, Harrison reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sleek black folder. "What's this?" she asked. "An emergency retainer," he said, "to hire you as a legal consultant. My team will handle the paperwork. You'll be paid and protected." Grace hesitated. "I'm not doing this for money." "I know," he said, "but I've learned not to let good people work for free. That's how they get taken advantage of." Grace took the folder. She'd entered the courtroom as a janitor, but now she was preparing to face a billionaire's legal war, and she wasn't afraid. She had the truth. And this time the truth had teeth. The next week was a blur of motion. Grace found herself inside sleek conference rooms lined with polished glass and brushed steel, surrounded by lawyers in $1,000 suits and legal assistants who typed faster than her eyes could follow. And yet in every meeting, every briefing, all eyes still circled back to her, the woman who had once scrubbed the building's floors and now sat with a binder full of evidence on her lap, like it was a weapon. Harrison had granted her full access to the legal team now handling his defense, though most of them remained cautiously skeptical. Grace understood. To them, she was still the outsider. No law degree, no credentials, just instinct and fire. But that fire had teeth. They had moved Harrison's defense team into a private war room, an isolated office suite rented just off Coltech's main campus. It had soundproof doors, 2 conference tables, 4 whiteboards, and surveillance-scrambled Wi-Fi. Every minute was spent combing through data counterbuilding timelines and anticipating every angle Jacqueline's legal offense might use. Harrison's former lead attorney, a slick man named Connor Ames, had officially withdrawn, citing irreconcilable differences with the client's intended defense. Grace translated that as Jacqueline scared him off, or paid him off. In his place, Harrison hired Miranda Teschner, a ferocious trial lawyer with a blunt gray bob and a voice that cut through pretense like a knife. The moment she met Grace, she had narrowed her eyes and asked, "So you're the maid who embarrassed the DA?" Grace didn't flinch. "No, I'm the woman who's going to help you win." Miranda grinned. "Good. Let's go win then." The next few days tested Grace in ways she hadn't expected. She was tasked with reconstructing timeline gaps in the accounting records, verifying access logs, and connecting obscure legal loopholes to prove intent. She read regulatory filings until her eyes blurred, slept for only 4 hours a night, and subsisted on coffee and microwave noodles. But she thrived in it because, for once, her work mattered. Late one evening, as she worked alone in the war room, Harrison walked in. He looked tired, a weariness that came from being both betrayed and misunderstood. He carried a bottle of sparkling water and a second coffee for her. "Still at it?" he asked. Grace took the coffee. "You think Jacqueline's going to sleep while we rest?" He chuckled and sat beside her. "You're extraordinary. You know that?" Grace gave a dry laugh. "I was sweeping the floors here 3 weeks ago." "And now you're holding the floor," he said. They sat in silence for a beat, watching the blinking cursor on her laptop screen. "I trusted Jacqueline more than anyone," he said finally. "When I brought her on as CFO, she was a rising star, brilliant, strategic. But she always hated my idealism." Grace looked over. "Idealism?" He nodded. "I believed companies could lead with conscience. That profit didn't have to come at the cost of people. She thought I was weak. Naive? She was wrong. I know that now. Thanks to you. Grace's cheeks warmed. She looked down at the spreadsheets again. Harrison continued. You know when the scandal hit and everyone ran? Part of me thought maybe they were right to leave. Maybe I was the fool. You weren't, she said firmly. But it was you, he said, voice lower, more intense, who stepped forward. You with no obligation, no power, just conviction. Grace hesitated. I didn't do it for you. He smiled softly. I know. That's why it meant everything. The moment hung charged. Grace turned back to the laptop, heart thudding too loudly. Miranda burst in, breaking the tension. I need everyone in the main room, she barked. We just received Jacqueline's defense strategy. She's going nuclear. Minutes later, the full team gathered around the large display screen in the war room. Miranda clicked to reveal an email from Jacqueline's legal team. They were shifting the blame to a rogue internal operative, implying Harrison had grown unstable after the death of his younger brother 2 years ago and was mentally unfit to run the company. A psychiatric report had been leaked to the press. She's not going after just your credibility, Miranda said grimly. She's going after your sanity. The room was quiet. Grace's hands curled into fists. She had seen this tactic before: discredit, destabilize, erase. If they could make Harrison look emotionally unstable, every shred of their evidence could be cast as paranoia. She's not going to win, Grace said through clenched teeth. Miranda looked at her. Then we better be ready to fight like hell. They had 1 week until the next hearing, 7 days to gather position and strike. The war had begun. The courthouse loomed tall and indifferent against the gray morning sky. News vans clogged the curb, reporters jockeyed for camera angles, and social media influencers live-streamed from their phones with theatrical commentary. Harrison Cole, former golden boy of tech innovation, was now the headline scandal on every major channel. Grace stood at the courthouse entrance in a fitted navy blazer and black slacks, a far cry from the Maid uniform she'd once worn. Her dark blonde hair was tied back tightly. Her face calm, but her fingers twitched inside her pocket as she stared at the rows of marble steps. Miranda stood to her left, rattling off last-minute strategy points. To her right, Harrison adjusted his tie with quiet tension. "You're sure you want to speak?" Grace Miranda asked one last time, searching her eyes. "Yes," Grace replied. "If Jacqueline wants to fight dirty, then let's show them what clean looks like." The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the hearing commenced. Rows of corporate executives, law clerks, curious civilians, and press crowded the gallery. Jacqueline Frost sat across the aisle at the defendant's table, serene and flawless in a tailored cream suit, her expression unreadable. Her new attorney, Greg Van Court, infamous for demolishing witnesses on cross, leaned in close and whispered something into her ear. She didn't look at him. She was focused on Harrison. The judge, a silver-haired woman with a sharp gaze named Evelyn Piers, entered and called for silence. What followed was a procedural summary, and then Jacqueline's legal team began their opening strategy. Van Court stood smoothly. "Your Honor, the defense intends to demonstrate that Mr. Cole Mr. Cole, while undoubtedly once a visionary, began exhibiting erratic behavior following a series of personal losses and psychological instability. We believe this deterioration in his judgment led to unsanctioned financial decisions made without board approval, and the current allegations against Ms. Frost are an unfortunate misplacement of blame." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Grace's stomach twisted. She could feel the insult: calculated, cruel, deliberate. They were painting Harrison as a man broken by grief, conveniently unfit, conveniently replaceable. Miranda stood next. "Your Honor, we will demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that Ms. Frost not only misused company resources for personal investment gain, but intentionally orchestrated a campaign to isolate and discredit Mr. Cole in order to seize control. We will present internal emails, financial trails, and testimony from those who witnessed her actions." Judge Pierce nodded. Very well. Let us proceed. The morning continued, with forensic accountants detailing anomalies Grace had helped uncover. Miranda's team mapped timelines and illuminated irregular transactions, but Jacqueline remained composed, her expression never faltering. Then it was Grace's turn. As she walked toward the witness stand, murmurs broke out again. The maid, the girl with no law degree. What could she possibly say? Miranda called her gently. Grace Walker, civilian analyst and former employee of Coltech. Grace raised her hand, swore her oath, and sat. Miss Walker, Miranda began. Can you tell the court how you became involved in this case? Grace spoke clearly. I worked as an overnight cleaning staff member at Coltech. One evening, I overheard a heated phone conversation between Ms. Frost and a board member about falsifying investor timelines. I didn't understand it fully then, but I recorded it. Something didn't feel right. Miranda nodded. And after Mircole's lawyer withdrew, what did you do? I stepped forward, Grace said. I didn't know if anyone would take me seriously, but I had seen enough to know he was being set up, so I began connecting the dots. Van Court rose. Objection. This witness is not an expert. She's speculating. Overruled, the judge said evenly. You'll get your cross, Mr. Van Court. Miranda guided Grace through her notes, exhibits, and analysis. Grace walked the courtroom through every timestamp transaction and coded maneuver Jacqueline had used to hide funds through shell vendors techniques Grace had studied during lonely nights and online tutorials. Her logic was clear, her voice unwavering. But it was during cross-examination that the real tension arrived. Van Court stood theatrical and dismissive. Miss Walker, he began, you scrubbed floors. Then you decided you were qualified to perform corporate financial audits. Grace didn't blink. I didn't decide I was qualified. The evidence spoke for itself. And you expect this court to believe a janitor? Objection, Miranda snapped. Disparagement? Sustained, said Judge Pierce. Van Court smirked. Let's try again. You claim Ms. Frost committed fraud. But isn't it possible you misunderstood what you saw? That your lack of education and professional experience led you to draw the wrong conclusions? Grace looked straight at him. What I lacked in credentials I made up for in integrity. And as for the conclusions, well, I suppose the financial audit logs, whistleblower statements, and internal memos will support those. Laughter flickered in the gallery. Van Court's face tensed. Jacqueline, for the first time, shifted slightly in her seat. Grace added, It's funny. The truth doesn't care who uncovers it, just that it's seen. She stepped down. As she returned to the plaintiff's table, Harrison leaned in. You just turned the entire room. But Grace didn't smile, because she knew they weren't done yet. The hardest blow was still coming. The courthouse lunch recess felt like a pressure valve barely holding. News headlines had already begun to spin. Former Maid exposes billion-dollar scandal, the janitor who might save a CEO. Grace sat on a bench outside the courtroom sipping lukewarm coffee, trying to slow her racing heart. She could still feel the heat of Jacqueline's glare across the room, measured icy, dangerous. Harrison sat beside her in silence, his elbows on his knees. You didn't have to do that, he said finally. They tried to humiliate you. I don't care about that, Grace replied. They were going to use your grief to erase you. I couldn't let that happen. He looked at her, the gratitude in his eyes restrained by years of discipline. Thank you. Just then Miranda appeared, phone in hand. Grace, we may have found something. Grace stood. What is it? The shell company Jacqueline used to funnel funds, Jasper Equity, just filed a corporate dissolution 2 weeks before this hearing. That's not just fishy, that's outright suspicious. Can we link it to her directly? Grace asked. Not easily, Miranda admitted. But if we can get her former assistant, Louisa Payne, to testify, she might be able to verify Jacqueline's signature on the transfer papers. Grace didn't hesitate. Then we need to find Louisa. Back inside the courtroom, the mood had shifted. Grace's testimony had rattled the defense more than they expected. Jacqueline sat upright composed, but her fingers tapped rapidly on the defense table. Vancourt resumed his cross-examinations, attempting to sow doubt in witnesses. His tone had grown sharper, even impatient. The judge noticed. The jury noticed. By late afternoon, Miranda requested an emergency subpoena for Louisa Payne, submitting evidence that her testimony could confirm the fraudulent transfer path. The judge approved it, and a recess was called until the next morning. Outside rain began to fall. Harrison offered Grace his jacket, but she shook her head. "You'll need it more. Tomorrow is going to be war." That night, Grace barely slept. She pored over every document again, memorizing names, checking figures. Her mind kept returning to one question: why had Jacqueline targeted Harrison so personally? It wasn't just a business move. It felt personal, calculated, with venom. The next morning, Louisa Payne arrived. A petite woman with fraying nerves and twitching hands, Louisa looked like someone who had been waiting to get something off her chest for a very long time. On the stand under oath, she unraveled the quiet terror that had ruled her final 6 months at Coltech. "I was instructed," she said, her voice trembling, "to draft wire transfers from Coltech subsidiaries to an investment group called Jasper Equity. I thought it was a merger at first, but the accounts were registered under Ms. Frost's brother's name." Gasps erupted again. "Did Miss Frost instruct you directly?" Miranda asked. Louisa hesitated. "Yes. She told me it was part of a long-term diversification plan. But she made me sign NDAs. And she said if I told anyone, I'd never work in this industry again." "And what made you come forward now?" Miranda asked gently. Louisa's eyes turned to Grace. "Because someone finally stood up to her." Vancourt stood nearly red in the face. "Ms. Payne, are you aware that your signature appears on multiple authorizations? Isn't it convenient to claim now that you were coerced?" Louisa's voice shook. "Convenient or not, it's the truth. I lied because I was afraid, and because she made people like me feel disposable." The courtroom held its breath. Grace exhaled slowly. This was it, the final blow. When the closing arguments began, Miranda spoke not just to the judge, but to every woman who had ever been silenced by someone in power. "Yes, my client is wealthy, but today is not about wealth. It is about manipulation, deception, and the systemic belief that people without power can be used and discarded." Ms. Frost exploited trust. She weaponized hierarchy, and she nearly destroyed a man who trusted her. Vancourt rattled, launched into a defensive monologue about structure oversight and plausible miscommunication. But the jury could feel it. The shift. The unraveling. After final remarks, the judge recessed court for deliberation. Grace stepped outside, trembling. "Whatever happens," Harrison said beside her, "you already saved me." She looked at him. "You were never the one on trial, Harrison. It was the truth." They waited. The verdict would come soon. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. 4 long, stretching, breathless hours, where the courthouse hallways seemed to hold their breath with the people pacing them. Grace didn't sit once. She paced the hallway floor in her low heels, rubbing her arms and muttering small prayers she didn't even realize she knew. Harrison stayed quiet, watching her, occasionally murmuring reassurances that never quite reached his own heart. Inside the courtroom, Jacqueline Frost waited behind a mask of poise. Her crimson lipstick hadn't smudged, her gray silk blouse still rested without a wrinkle on her shoulders, but her fingers tapped an unconscious rhythm of worry. When the jury returned, it was as if time cracked open. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the room filled with the sound of bodies rising from benches, breaths hitching. Grace clutched the wooden edge of the plaintiff's table. Her fingers trembled. The foreman stood with the paper in hand. The judge nodded. "In the matter of Frost versus Cole on the count of fiduciary misconduct and fraudulent asset misappropriation, we find in favor of the defendant Harrison Cole." Gasps erupted. Grace blinked. She barely heard the rest. The judge banged her gavel twice, then dismissed the jury. "Court is adjourned." It was over. Jacqueline didn't move. She sat frozen, mouth slightly parted like a glass statue that had just been struck. Grace turned to Harrison, whose face was unreadable shock, disbelief, and something deeper. "I told you," she whispered. The truth had weight. The media were already swarming outside. The headlines were probably written before the judge even left her bench. Cole vindicated. After explosive testimony, whistleblower Maid saves tech tycoon. Grace Walker becomes voice for the silenced. But for Grace, none of that mattered. The only thing she felt was relief. Later that afternoon, as most reporters packed up and Jacqueline was ushered out the back by her legal team, Grace stepped into a quiet hallway off the main court atrium. Her hands still trembled, her throat dry from hours of silence and strain. Harrison found her there, leaning against the window, looking out at the gray clouds rolling in over the city. "I owe you everything," he said. "You owe me nothing," she replied without turning around. He stepped beside her. "You reminded me of who I used to be before the boardroom politics and brand projections. You made me fight for something real again." She turned now, looking at him. "You didn't give up?" she said. "That's the only reason I could step in." He smiled, a quiet, real smile. "I have to ask, what happens to you now? Do you go back to cleaning offices, or—" She laughed softly. "That's over. I don't know what comes next, but I know it's more than mops and silence." A beat passed. "There's something else," he said. "I want you to come work for me." She blinked, doing what head of community ethics and internal oversight. "You have the mind, the heart, and frankly, you see things no one else does. That's what my company needs." She stared at him, unsure whether to cry or laugh again. "You're serious, as serious as I've ever been." Grace hesitated, her mind flipping through self-doubt and disbelief, the shadows of past rejection. The echo of janitor jokes whispered behind her back, but all of it melted under one thought. She had earned this. And not because someone gave her a chance, but because she seized it. She nodded. "Okay, but I want one condition." "Anything," he said. "I want interns from working-class backgrounds. No Ivy League requirements, no boardroom grooming, just potential." Harrison held out his hand. "You've got it." They shook hands, but something deeper passed between them, something stronger than power or justice. Respect. 2 weeks later, the headlines were already old news. Jacqueline Frost had resigned from her roles pending formal investigation and a shareholder revolt. The scandal rocked the industry with a ripple effect across boardrooms around the country. But inside Coltech's downtown headquarters, a new nameplate was affixed to an office door: Grace Walker, Director of Ethics and Inclusion. She sat inside surrounded by warm wood glass and light. On her desk was a photo of her mother, the woman who used to clean houses to pay the bills, and next to it, a bronze plaque that read, "Truth doesn't need a title. It just needs someone willing to speak it." Grace Walker thought the hard part was over. She had survived the courtroom, the scrutiny, the whispers about a maid pretending to be a lawyer, and had somehow emerged victorious. But stepping into her new role at Coltech, she found the battles weren't behind her, they were simply changing shape. The announcement of her appointment caused immediate tremors inside the company. She wasn't surprised when several department heads refused to meet with her during the first week. Her emails received polite deferrals or were quietly ignored. In break rooms and elevators, conversations stopped when she entered. Even the janitorial staff, the very people she had once worked beside, now eyed her with a strange mix of admiration and distance. The problem wasn't just that she used to clean floors. It was that she had crossed a line they never expected her to approach, let alone breach. And not everyone liked what that meant. Her first executive meeting was a cold war of glances and passive resistance. Harrison, seated at the head of the glass conference table, introduced her with pride. "This is Grace Walker. She'll be overseeing community ethics and internal practices. I've given her full authority to review our current protocols, from recruitment to whistleblower protection. One of the VPs, a sharp-faced woman named Brenda Niles, shifted uncomfortably. That's admirable. But with all due respect, Mir Cole, what exactly are Ms. Walker's qualifications beyond courtroom theatrics? There was a long silence. Grace didn't flinch. I have no formal legal degree, she said calmly, but I've lived every step of this company's failures from the inside. I've cleaned the corners no one sees, heard the things no one reports. I know what it feels like to be invisible and to be underestimated. She leaned forward. And I also know how dangerous that is. Because what you ignore can one day stand on a witness bench and burn everything down. Brenda raised her brows, but said nothing. Harrison smiled, faintly proud. Grace got to work. She reviewed hundreds of employee files, conducted one-on-one interviews with junior staff, and initiated anonymous feedback channels. Her style was unorthodox. She ate lunch in the staff cafeteria, walked the building floors without an entourage, and offered genuine listening instead of corporate lingo. Some resisted, but some started to talk. She uncovered patterns: quiet terminations, following internal complaints, consistent underrepresentation in mid-management promotions tied more to social clubs than performance. She compiled the data into a report she titled simply, "The Rot in the Marble." She didn't soften her language. When she presented it at the quarterly strategy meeting, you could hear a pin drop. This isn't a hit piece, she concluded. This is a mirror. We can either break it or use it. For a moment, she thought no one would clap. But then Harrison stood. And then, surprisingly so, did a young man from engineering and a middle-aged woman from HR. By the end of the meeting, more than half the room was on their feet. It wasn't universal approval, but it was a start. That night, Grace sat alone in her small apartment. She still hadn't moved to a nicer place. She wasn't sure she wanted to. She brewed tea and opened a letter that had arrived earlier that day. It was handwritten, no return address. Inside it said, "You didn't just defend him. You defended all of us who never got the chance." Underneath was a single line, "Keep going." She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the same drawer that held her mother's old work badge from the hospital laundry. The next morning, she walked into Coltech with her head a little higher. The same people who whispered a week ago now watched her with cautious respect. She didn't smile to prove anything. She smiled because finally, the noise didn't drown out her purpose. Grace knew the fight wasn't over. There would be more resistance, more smirks behind closed doors. People would still question why someone like her dared to be in charge of anything. But she had seen the worst of people and the best. She had watched a billionaire trust a maid when the world walked away. She had heard silence fill a courtroom after truth was spoken without credentials. She had stood up when no one expected her to, and now she had no plans of sitting down. 6 months into her new role, Grace Walker had restructured most of the internal ethics protocols, rebuilt employee feedback systems, and opened confidential investigations into past misconduct. Her changes were radical, but effective. Employee satisfaction metrics were rising. Whispered stories about office favoritism began to fade. Harrison Cole's company was becoming a different place. But with progress came pushback. The board wasn't thrilled. Behind closed doors, some accused Harrison of being blinded by gratitude or manipulated by an emotional story. Others whispered that Grace was dismantling structures that had, for better or worse, helped keep Coltech profitable. When the next board meeting was called, Harrison received a memo that alarmed even him. The board had requested an independent audit, not just of company finances, but of Grace's activities. There were claims that she had overstepped her authority, spent corporate resources on personal investigations, and destabilized internal harmony. Grace read the memo twice, then set it down. "They're trying to silence you," Harrison said. She nodded. "It was only a matter of time. They want to vote on removing you next quarter." Grace looked him in the eye. "Then I'll give them a reason to remember why I'm here. What she did next shocked everyone. She requested an open employee forum broadcast live to every Coltech location with anonymous questions taken in real time. It was the first of its kind. Executives objected. Lawyers warned against it. But Harrison backed her. The forum was scheduled on a Monday morning. At 9:00 a.m., sharp Grace stood on the main stage in a modest navy blazer. No teleprompter, no notes. Just her and a sea of employees. Some curious, some skeptical, some watching from break rooms across the country. "I know many of you don't trust me," she began. "I know you've heard I'm just a maid with a borrowed title, that I don't belong here." She paused. "You're right." A murmur swept through the crowd. "I don't belong here if here means a place where status matters more than truth, where voices are ignored because they come from the wrong floor." She lifted a folder from the podium. "In the last 6 months, I've heard over 300 employee stories, stories of being overlooked, dismissed, retaliated against. I can't erase the past, but I can name it." She began reading. A single mother passed over for promotion 3 times because her schedule was too complicated. A brilliant coder whose autism diagnosis led to being reassigned to a quieter team, not by request, but assumption. A Latino janitor whose report of verbal abuse by a senior manager vanished somewhere between HR and nowhere. By the time she finished, the auditorium was silent. These aren't exceptions. These are the system. The same system that nearly let an innocent man go to prison while his own lawyer walked away. Her voice didn't tremble. "I defended him because no one else would. Now I'm defending this company from itself." The anonymous question feed exploded. One said, "I was one of the people who doubted you. I don't anymore." Another, "I filed a complaint last year and thought no one read it. You just read it aloud, thank you." Harrison sat in the front row, arms crossed, watching as his company remembered its humanity. When the board tried to challenge her authority later that week, Harrison walked into the meeting with a signed petition from over 4,000 employees supporting Grace. They never brought up her dismissal again. But not everyone surrendered. Late one evening, as she was leaving the office, Grace found an envelope slipped under her office door. No name, no stamp. Just one sentence typed on plain paper: "Know your place." She stared at it, then calmly fed it into the shredder. Grace Walker didn't scare easy. She'd already walked through fire, been underestimated, overlooked, dismissed, and dismissed again. And yet here she stood in the center of a building she used to mop, now carrying the weight of its conscience. She had one final goal before the year was out. She would make Coltech not just a better company, but a model for what leadership could look like when built not on pedigree but on principle. She had defended a billionaire once. Now she was defending something even more fragile, a second chance. On a quiet winter morning, nearly a year after Grace first stepped into that courtroom wearing a borrowed jacket and borrowed courage, the grand auditorium of Coltech buzzed with a different kind of energy. Employees filled the rows. Some wore casual sweaters and warm smiles. Others carried flowers notes or just a look of quiet gratitude. The occasion, a company-wide celebration for the year's transformation and the announcement of a new internal initiative. But what most people came for was something else, something unspoken. They came for her. Grace stood backstage with her hands folded, heart thumping louder than any speech she had ever made. On the stage, a banner read, "Voices that built us." She had spent the last year building trust, creating policies, empowering the voiceless. She had no idea that in the process she had become something of a symbol, not a CEO, not a martyr, but something even rarer, a woman who saw what was broken and stayed long enough to fix it. Harrison stepped up to the podium, no suit, just a simple shirt and blazer, the kind that made him look like any other man in the room. But when he spoke, everyone listened. There's a strange irony in what I'm about to say. He began with a soft smile. that a man with every resource at his disposal, with the best lawyers, advisors, and money in the world, was saved by someone most of the world never saw. The room fell silent. She saved me in court, yes, but she also saved this company. From itself. From me. From all of us who forgot what leadership should be built on. He turned toward the curtain. Grace Walker. Please join me. She stepped out. The applause hit like a wave. She paused, blinking, almost stunned. Harrison motioned her to the podium. She stood still for a second, overwhelmed, then began to speak. I didn't think this would be my life, she said softly. I thought I'd spend my days cleaning up after other people's lives. But what I didn't know was that sometimes when you clean long enough, you start to see things others don't. Laughter. Soft, warm, genuine. I saw the fear in Harrison's eyes that day in court. Not the fear of guilt, but the fear of being invisible in the eyes of a system designed to measure worth by the wrong things. She glanced around the room. I know that fear. I lived it. I still do sometimes. Being poor, being dismissed, being called unqualified before anyone reads your name. Her voice grew steady, but I also saw the courage. In every employee who came to me with a complaint they were sure would be ignored. In every manager who risked their comfort to change how they hired, promoted, and listened. And in every soul who dared to believe that maybe, just maybe, what we build here can be different. She looked at Harrison. You gave me a chance. You didn't have to. You trusted a stranger when even her own voice was shaking. So now I want to do the same for someone else. She reached under the podium and pulled out a folder. This is Project Reclaim. It's a mentorship and hiring initiative for people who've been overlooked, whether because of their background, lack of education, or just the wrong zip code. We're not just building jobs, we're building ladders for people like me. The room erupted. Not just applause this time, standing ovation. In the days that followed, news of the speech went viral. Media outlets dubbed her the Maid who rewrote corporate justice, but inside the walls of Coltech, she was something simpler. Grace, the woman who always had time to listen, who never forgot a name even in a company of thousands, who walked the halls with the humility of a maid and the fire of a founder. Months later, as the snow returned and the city glowed under winter lights, Grace sat at the corner booth of a modest cafe sipping coffee with Harrison. No press, no schedule, just two people who had walked through chaos and come out the other side. You ever think about that courtroom day? Harrison asked. She smiled. Every time I doubt myself. And now she looked at him, her face soft. Now I remember that the most powerful thing you can say in this world is I believe you. I will defend you, even when no one else does. He nodded slowly. And sometimes the person you end up saving is the one who looked like they had everything. They sat in quiet understanding. Outside, the world moved on. But something had changed, not just in a courtroom, not just in a company, but in the hearts of those who saw what one woman could do when the world handed her nothing, and she used it to build something that could never be bought. Not with status, not with power, only with grace.